Hello, Michael here. Because the team is on break for the holidays, today we're pulling an episode from the Patreon Vault. So here's our episode on Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, released to our patrons back in June of 2020. We were still getting used to remote recording at that time, and so we had some technical problems with the software we were using, so the audio isn't as clean as we would normally want. But 'tis the season of Spider-Man, so we thought this was an appropriate episode. And this episode is one of over 25 patron-exclusive episodes available to Beyond the Screenplay patrons. So, if you want to check out those episodes, head over to the Beyond the Screenplay Patreon. The link is in the show notes, or just go to patreon.com/beyondthescreenplay. We hope you have a very happy New Year's, and we'll see you in the next episode. Hello, patrons. Welcome to our bonus episode on Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the 2018 film written by Film Lord and Rodney Rotham, directed by Bob Pereschetti, Peter Ramsey, and Rodney Rotham. I am joined, of course, by the Lessons from Screenplay team, Trisha Rand.
Hello, everyone.
Brian Bittner.
Hello, hello.
And Alex Calleros.
Hi.
So there are lots of things to talk about with this movie. And, you know, the animation style, the visuals, the fact that it's a Spider-Man story number 27 or whatever that's happening in movies and in all the places. But Trisha, if I'm not mistaken, this was on your top 10 of the decade list. Is that right?
That's true, yeah.
So
I don't remember where I placed it on that list, but I mean, I really, really love this movie.
Yeah. Well, yeah, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, it came out in December of 2018. So it was right at the end of the year there. And I saw it, it would have had to have been on New Year's Eve or somewhere right around that point. And it's just such a blast. Like, nothing prepares you for how innovative it looks. And the approach to the story is this amazing thematic thing where the entire story design is about how Spider-Man is, or like that sort of hero thing is for everyone and like can look like anything. And so the fact that it looks kind of off the wall and wild and this variety of animation styles and the entire plot of it is about multiverse kind of stuff and there's different spider people. It's just a really amazing, there's nothing I love more than when the plot and the content of a movie is saying the same thematic thing where it's not, the theme is not layered on top, it's the fundamental design element of the plot, and that's what we get here. And there's that meta factor to it as well that just makes it extra sort of like crowd pleasing and delicious to watch, and in addition to being hilarious and delightful at every turn. So yeah, I've seen it probably, I don't know, half a dozen times since it came out, and every time I'm blown away by it.
Yeah, I remember there was so much buzz around it when it came out, and you know, I think I'm now known in this group as the Marvel Scrooge, or Grinch, because yeah, I've never been like a huge comic superhero fan in general, but also just kind of got fatigued with Marvel. But man, like, when I walked out of this movie theater experience, I was just so freaking happy. Like, it was just such a purely pleasurable cinematic experience from start to finish in the way that Scott Pilgrim was, you know, for me, where it was like, I had forgotten what it felt like for a movie to just kind of take me by the hand and just do things like have a flow that almost feels like impossibly smooth and perfect throughout. Which actually takes immaculate crafting, but you just feel like you're in such good hands, and you're actually seeing new things. You're actually feeling new things because just the art and the visuals of it are so innovative. Yeah, I'm like a kid in a candy shop with this movie. I love revisiting it, and it puts a big smile on my face.
Totally.
It's such a crazy in-your-face ride of a movie. Like, you know, we recently talked about Scott Pilgrim versus the World on Patreon, and like it has that, just like watching it for the second time for this felt like watching it for the first time, because it felt like my brain didn't retain 80% of the movie. And then like I watched it last night, and then today, before we started recording, I was like scrubbing through it just to be like, what happens? Like, there's so much that I just can't keep track of in an amazing way, in a way where it just feels like every second you are being like thrust into this new chapter of the movie, you know, like a new sequence that completely turns the rest of the movie on its head. And it's just, yeah, it's such a blast.
Yeah, Scott Pilgrim, of course, is a really apt comparison because of the like comic book aesthetic anyway,
Right.
but
Mhm.
also just how kinetic it is, where it captures that feeling. It's just breathtaking, like the way it goes by and like through you almost.
Right.
Yeah,
You're just like holding on. You're like holding on for dear life in the
Right.
most wonderful way. Yeah.
yeah, it
And
hijacks your
as
brain and takes control of like your consciousness in this
Right.
insane way.
And as we talked about on the Scott Pilgrim podcast, it's just one of those movies where you can like look at any 30 seconds of it and just like talk about how much work was put into it and how many little things there are. It's appropriately in Times Square in Spider-Verse. There's a poster for From Dusk Till Dawn, the
Right.
like
I noticed that this
Spider-Verse
time.
sequel to Shaun of the Dead.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, well, it's interesting hearing about the just the the process of making this insane movie. And there's in particular an interview with Rodney Rotham on the podcast series, the Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith, which is one of my favorite ones. And yeah, he talks so much about how this kind of thing, like animation, is unique in that it lets you be hyper collaborative from start to finish. And I feel like that's, you really feel that, like that's completely, it's on the screen in every frame of this movie, how the art direction and visual effects and technology had to pair with the writing and the theme and the like the property at large. Like just all of it is happening in a really impressively integrated way.
Yes.
And I feel like that's, you know, probably, you know, that's, there's 3 directors credited and, you know, 2 writers. And I think that's one of the cool things that different modes of storytelling in this kind of filmmaking world like can let you do. And I'm honestly kind of jealous of it. Like that's so cool. It's an interesting comparison to Scott Pilgrim, where we kind of hang it all on Edgar Wright and like how singular this vision must be. But here's this kind of other way to arrive at that thing that is like hyper collaborative with many people over a very long, well, not actually, I guess, that long of a period of time. It seems, from what I understand, they like spent like a year and a half figuring out like the first 3 seconds, I think is what they said, is like, here's what it like this movie can possibly be. And then it was like, and now we have to finish the rest of it in a year and a half. So it was an interesting schedule for sure.
Yeah, I think they said they had 2 animators that worked for a year on 10 seconds of it. Basically just trying to figure out how it was going to look and come together. And then I think the number by the end was something like 150 animators that they had working on it, which was like the most at the time that Sony had ever like had. Anyway, but yeah, you do get that sense of a lot of people's brains and hands on it. And that helps to create, you know, the thing about having one director or like creative brain, one vision, is that often, you know, as we sort of talked about with Apocalypse Now, is that some of the stuff that happens is kind of beyond your control. And that's, if that's what you're going for, like Coppola was with Apocalypse Now, then that can be a really good thing. But it ends up being accidental. Whereas, as you were saying on that podcast, animation is the polar opposite of that. And this particular kind of animation is like every single tiny frame and every little tiny bit of everything that's in a frame. And that, like, down to the sound mix and every like bit of throwaway dialogue or whatever, all has to be like go through this. I don't know. I'm reminded of like a filtration process, right? Where it's like refined and refined and refined until it ends up on the screen.
And I'm really glad that they're pushing the sequel, like that they're not releasing a sequel for another 2 years yet, just because as much as I'd like to see a sequel sooner, I'm just happy whenever someone says, let's give this the time it needs to actually do it right. It could have been easy to say, oh, we already made all these assets and animation, we know how to do it now, so let's push out a sequel a year later or something. And it's just, it wouldn't be as good. You know, if you're going to make another one of these movies, it better be something special.
Yeah. Michael, you mentioned something about there's this special collaborative energy in this movie. And I was watching this film and realizing that some of the just like giddiness I felt, I had recently felt playing video games.
Mhm.
Like new, like, like newer, incredibly slick, cinematic, imaginative, really huge like video game properties like have the same kind of feel. And I think it that's also an incredibly collaborative medium. Like video games are like really hardcore collaboration where like it's even more integrated, where the narrative storytelling is affected by gameplay, and it's constant back and forth. It's interesting how it seems like there's something new coming out of that. Like for me at least, like I'm most delighted and surprised in my recent time as a media consumer by consuming things that seem to be made in this more collaborative way. They're taking me on more of a ride and putting me back in that childlike state again in a way that some of these more singular visions aren't. So I don't know if that's a real correlation, but I'm just noticing that. It's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and so it's interesting also that you mentioned video games, because this kind of transitions into one of the things that I find fascinating about this movie is how many Spider-Man stories we've had.
Mhm.
And so, of course, yeah, so, there was the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. Then there was the Amazing Spider-Man films by Mark Webb, which I thought was a trilogy. I went back and looked at it, but it's just the two. It felt like a trilogy.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, they nuked the fridge right with the second movie and was like, okay, let's move
yeah.
on.
And then like at the same time that this was happening was, MCU, Tom Holland Spider-Man being brought in, and then also the Spider-Man, Marvel's Spider-Man is the name of the PS4 game that came out, that as we're recording today, they announced the sequel where you get to play as Miles Morales. To me, I think Spider-Man on paper is not an appealing superhero, like isn't an obviously
Really?
appealing superhero. I mean, like you get bitten by an insect and now you're a spider. Like I think,
Well, I guess maybe I'm thinking more of the Peter Parker character.
Right.
Is very appealing. Yeah.
sure, like I think that's what gives it the interesting thing, and I think that's what's good about all good superhero movies is it's not the powers that they get, it's the people that it's affecting.
Right.
And so I think there is just this weird kind of magical marriage between who Peter Parker is and these spider abilities that for some reason makes it such a lasting like character, and in ways that I think I'm surprised others aren't. I don't know. It strikes me as interesting that we all love Spider-Man so much.
Alex hit the nail on the head, which is that it is about Peter Parker. I think it's less people saying, oh my gosh, can you believe he can stick to walls? Because it's like we live in an age where you can see any superhero do anything, basically. So it's
Right.
that's not interesting. But you look at something like Superman, who's just like, has almost no weaknesses, has almost no flaws, is just this sort of like very kind of vanilla character. And, different movies have played with that a little. Then you have Iron Man or Batman, who, okay, they're a human, so they don't actually have any powers, but they're also billionaires and, and all this kind of stuff. And then you have someone like Peter Parker, who is just an awkward kid in high school and, has like day-to-day issues that he has to do his pizza deliveries or whatever it is. And then he gets a superpower and he is juggling these two lives. And I think that's where the appeal of Spider-Man comes in, not the fact that he has spider-like abilities.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned this in our Infinity War and Endgame podcast, but Spider-Man, in terms of Marvel's like timeline, Spider-Man really heralded the coming of what we call the Silver Age of comics, which was post World War II, and it was a shift into more human, flawed, in his case, irreverent, comic book heroes that didn't take themselves super seriously. They weren't like gods or whatever, or aliens, as so many of the early DC comics were in the golden age of comics. And Spider-Man really embodies that. But I think one of the biggest things is something you just touched on, Bri, which is his youth. He is our youngest superhero. And I think that there's something so lovable about how naive he is. And that's kind of a hallmark of all like manifestations of the Spider-Man character, is that he's essentially naive. where he believes with this childlike faith that he can make things better. Whereas a lot of our older heroes have this weariness to them or just a detachment. So somebody like Wonder Woman or Superman has this detachment because they're not human. Somebody like Batman or Iron Man, they're very human and they're very flawed, but they're like kind of dark because they're old, right? They don't have that like old, all respect. They're middle-aged. They're middle-aged.
We're all becoming dark.
Right, but in the same way that, as we talked about when we were talking about Bond, in the same way that James Bond is always middle-aged, you have to have sort of that maturity to have that accompanying darkness, which is interesting to us, but it doesn't have the spark that the youth of Spider-Man does. And so this particular adaptation where we have, this kid, Miles Morales, who is truly a kid, right? He's got, and this is another thing that
way cooler than Peter Parker, to be clear.
Way cooler than Peter Parker. But he has a family and he like has older people in his life that are talking him through things, not just the classic Aunt May kind of a person that Peter Parker tends to have. Miles Morales has parents and, an uncle that he really looks up to. There's that mentor figure dynamic, which we see even more with Peter B. Parker in this movie as he shows up. But yeah, I think the young piece is really essential to this, and Spider-Verse does it spectacularly.
Well, one thing I really appreciated about Spider-Verse in particular is that it seemed like it was actually plugged into what like a Gen Z kid would be, and like social media literacy is like in the movie. It seems like it's so frustrating to watch high school movies made by boomers who are still thinking it's like the 80s or something.
Right.
So I really appreciated how this movie didn't feel out of touch with what it's like to actually be a teenager.
And the soundtrack really helps.
Absolutely.
I watched the trailer for The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and there was a moment where like Harry Osborn is like, Peter, what have you been up to? And Peter's like, oh, I don't know, I've been doing some web design. And I was like, oh no. Sorry, what are you gonna say, Brian?
Well, the music, I think it's funny because I feel like every single element of this movie just feels like it's ahead of its time, and we can get into just all the style choices and everything. But I was thinking the music is really cool because you have unique music to the different characters. Like when Gwen gives her backstory, it's like, this is not the sort of cinematic hip hop that we have for Miles, which works so well for his character, and just like it gives the movie this, like we're saying, kinetic energy, but it could just be, we're going to use the same crazy music for every scene, but it's not. It changes dramatically, but it all flows together. Like when the Prowler is chasing Peter and there's that like terrifying sound that keeps happening.
That music,
and then the music too. Like it's really cool.
I mean, everything in this movie, as you said, Trisha, is so integrated. Like that's what is so remarkable about it. There's kind of a moment when he's having his like rebirth, when he kind of gets his confidence back and is swinging to the particle collider. And there's a sense that the music is even melding together. There's like the kinetic hip hop with the movie's theme, the like score theme, have this like magical marriage in that moment. And yeah, it's that Scott Pilgrim feeling once again of just like, I don't have to even like, there's some movies where it's like, I feel like I'm doing a little bit of work to like fill in the blanks or to like kind of like forgive it for like not being perfect in this way or for just, letting me down in this way. And with the movie like this, it's just like, I'm so carried by it. And it's constantly delighting me with just how much more awesome it's getting constantly. I think that's why it reminds me of being a kid again. And in the same way I'm talking about like certain video games is like, it's gotten me out of my filmmaker brain where like, I'm no longer even able to assess what's even happening to me because it's just like so remarkable, the integration and the flow state that I've been put in by this movie.
Well, it does that thing that all really great metropolitan, where when you have a movie that takes place in a city with great diversity of experiences and great diversity of perspectives and cultures all mashed together, what you want from that kind of movie is that similar mashup feeling where there is something harmonious about the chaos of life in a metropolitan city and all of these different cultures coexisting. And what this movie does so incredibly is take, 5 different spider people from different dimensions, but unite them with one experience and one place. They all live in their own version of New York, right? Which is where this happens to be set. And it creates that like unity out of this great diversity. They do the same thing with the music. They do the same thing with the visuals. They do the same thing throughout all of the creative choices in this. It's, again, when you see that every single choice is united around a theme, that's when a movie that's what a movie can do and can be. And I'm blown away at the level of detail that they managed to pull together that feels like one cohesive vision, even though the thing it's doing is capturing all of the differences between all of these different things.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. The fact that the different spider people have their own animation style and visual style, and it still all works together is like, my brain doesn't understand it.
That's probably why it feels kind of miraculous, is because a movie that has all this packed into it should feel disjointed and actually unpleasant. I've seen movies that try to do too much but don't have this like unity at the center of it, or this confidence or this care, and they do feel disorienting in not a good way. And the magic of this film is that it should be kind of a chaotic mess, and yet it's somehow not, because of the craft and the care that was put into it.
Well, it's cool because they talk about, again, in that same interview that I listened to, Rodney Rotham talks about the process of doing, feedback screenings. I forget what's the name of that. Test screenings, yeah. And how they did a bunch of them, and how you kind of like hate them on one hand, but also how useful they are. And I think that's another thing that's kind of interesting about this collaborative mode of storytelling that we're talking about, where it's like, if you're a singular director that's putting your vision out into the world, you probably don't want to hear what people have to like. It doesn't matter what people think. Like, I'm going to make my movie, darn it. But in this like collaborative, I don't know why I went with darn it. And I felt that.
It's a Patreon exclusive
language.
We can curse.
But yeah, that it was very important to have screenings with people. And he was also saying, especially when you're doing something that is supposed to be fun and supposed to be funny, like you have to kind of know if it's working for people. And he cited a moment where, the different spider people are talking about their backstories. And originally, like almost until the final cut, Pig Spider-Man, what's his name?
Spider-Ham.
Spider-Ham. Of course, it gets to him, and it's this emotional moment, and he says something about like my uncle or my cousin was like burned alive, and it smelled so good. And he's saying it like with tears coming down his eyes, but it's like a joke. And the problem was that it was a joke, and everyone was laughing, and it was ruining the tone, and like people then weren't paying attention to what came afterward. And so it was an example of how a test screening showed that a joke was working, but that was actually a bad thing. And so they took it out to preserve that moment. And so I think that's again just one of those cool things about this, a more iterative process in storytelling, where you're kind of, it's a give and take from the audience, and you're kind of crafting this thing. I think it's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, one of the things that I wasn't sure how this movie was going to do at all is place itself and exist within the different like Spider-Man lore and mythology and the different movies that we've had in this century. Like, right. I think
in this decade, like plus minus a year and a half, basically.
Correct. And so by nature almost has to do something meta, where it has to acknowledge that it exists within a very modern and ongoing mythology about this character. And the way that they solved it by giving us the Jake Johnson, Peter B. Parker, giving us that version, as well as the Chris Evans version, which I don't remember what his middle initial is.
Chris Pine. Wrong handsome Chris.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Chris Pine. You're right. I apologize. That version of Peter Parker, as well as the Jake Johnson version of Peter Parker, it's really wise to start off with these two that are very familiar to us before giving us the Miles character, and then like working in slowly we have the Gwen character, and just giving us more and more where you are standing on the same platform that's already been built in a way. And I heard they were originally even thinking of casting Tobey Maguire to do the voice.
They were,
Right.
yeah.
They thought it'd be too like confusing of like, wait, is this in that original universe, or which universe is this in?
Right.
Or
Yeah, they were worried about it being confusing.
In one of the like next Spider-Man movies, I just want to see like Peter walks into a pawn shop or something, and the two guys behind the counter are Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire, and they're just like bickering people. Like they have nothing. They're not playing Peter Parker. They're just like two random like glorified extras in the movie. No, but I agree. That was a big thing for me. I think with this movie was how quickly within 60 seconds of the movie starting, like, all right, let's do this again. We're going to make fun of Spider-Man 3 because that was ridiculous. Like, we are going to talk about all the things that have already happened. And, first of all, it lets you sort of feel a little relieved that you don't have to now like come into a brand new thing that's trying to pretend everything doesn't exist before. Like the Andrew Garfield, the first movie, I enjoyed it, and I thought, okay, but they just rebooted it. They did the origin story again, and then it was very smart of the MCU to introduce Tom Holland and say, look, you're already Spider-Man. We know you're Spider-Man, but now you're going to be an Avenger. And it's like, okay, cool. We don't have to do that whole thing again with this third live action Spider-Man. And then, of course, while all this is happening, the comics and the animated series are introducing Miles Morales and doing all these different things. So I agree that it's just like very smart to start off this movie by saying, here's the Spider-Man, and then we kill him, which is like, first of all, just a very strong tone choice for the movie, but it also lets the audience know we are not in that world anymore. We are moving on to this new iteration of Spider-Man. That doesn't mean that Spider-Man can't continue to exist in the MCU or in cartoons or wherever, but this movie is leaving that behind. We are moving forward from that. It just very smartly says, here's what we're leaving behind, and here's where we're going.
Yeah.
I mean, and I also like just the stakes that are created where it's like,
of course,
oh, you can kill a Spider-Man, like and there's going to be multiple Spider people, and like this movie is saying they can die. That's possible because this is a multiverse, and that's I really thought that they were going to kill off Peter B. Parker, in the end. And so I was actually kind of delighted that he got to live because I love that character. But I believe that he could die, because the stakes were there from the beginning.
Yeah.
When I feel like, as you were saying, Trisha, it's putting us in kind of the same headspace as Miles also, where like he exists in this world where Spider-Man also exists, and he's probably seen Spider-Man, do the Christmas album and like all that stuff. So I feel like it's doing multiple things at once, where it's putting us in the headspace of the protagonist, and also like telling us on that meta level, like, yeah, no, it's okay. We know we're doing another Spider-Man. We know, it's okay. Trust us, and we can kind of just go from here,
right?
Which is cool.
Yeah. We could just talk about Miles for a few minutes as a character before he even gets bitten. It is so cool to have a character that already has like skills and interests and passions. And normally what we see from the Peter Parker character is like, he's a reporter, so he's into photography and
I'm
science.
a nerd and science.
Yeah, exactly. But to see a street smart like kid then become Spider-Man is really cool. And he has like so much swagger, and like most of this movie, he has breathtaking confidence. But the moment where his dad makes him like,
yes,
where he's like, I love you, son, and you don't get to go to school unless you say it back. It's really, and he's capable of being embarrassed, right? He's a confident kid, but he has that like lovable awkwardness, which is where the humor comes from, but it's also where that humanness and the flawedness comes from.
Yeah. I think that's definitely my favorite scene. Like, I think that's where I was like, okay, cool. This is like a really fun way to capture so much of like the same essence of Peter Parker, but like in this completely different package. And it's just also just cool to see like this like loving relationship between him and his father, where it's like, oh,
Yeah.
Dad, don't do this to me, but also like he's gonna say I love you back. And like I like that framing device of like, it's, yeah, we're in a different place, but there's still like that love and warmth and fun in this character that's going to get explored.
It's a really sweet relationship between him and his parents.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Also, Brian Tyree Henry as the father, who like I only know as Paperboy from Atlanta or Beale Street Can Talk, like where I'm not used to taking him as like a sort of adult serious character, and he just plays the voice so well, which I was really impressed by.
Oh, that's him. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating.
And then Mahershala Ali as Uncle Aaron, which can't go wrong with.
It's great. It's weird because Zoe Kravitz as Mary Jane sounded a lot like Kirsten Dunst to me the first time.
Yeah.
Where I was like, oh, did they just cast Kirsten Dunst? And then when I learned it was Zoe Kravitz, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I would not have guessed that they would sound the same.
When we see a Spider-Man origin story, we come in with certain expectations, and this movie takes great care to mess up our expectations right out of the gate. He's living with his parents. He absolutely, they're still alive. And it's funny, like his uncle ends up dead by the end of this, but, so much about the way that it goes is so unexpected. And Peter B. Parker almost more becomes that like mentor figure to him. And the ending is so cute when Peter B. Parker says like, I love you to him. It's just adorable. It's like, I love you. I'm so proud of you. Maybe I want kids.
I love his little sidelines, like when he's like, who's that, talking about Olivia Octavius, Doc Ock, and they say, oh, she's the head of the department. He's like, okay, cool, I'll have to rethink my personal biases anyway, and then we'll go here.
Right.
Yeah.
It goes back to that infinite complexity where at every moment this movie is doing 8 things at once, and things that seem like it shouldn't be possible to do them all at once, and yet it is. And so it's exactly that, where you're first confronting the villain, and yet there's so much humor, there's so much action, there's like an amazing soundtrack, there's lots of like character work that's happening at the same time. It's just firing on all cylinders constantly.
Oh, just on the Peter B. Parker making side comments, he also provides kind of a voice to the meta voice. He's saying, yeah, pretty standard Spider-Man stakes.
Right.
Check.
He's almost Deadpool in a way.
Right.
Aside from the fact that their costumes look very similar, but this sort of like we're living in like meta joke world rather than like we're taking this super seriously.
And I also love that with Miles, again, in just that quick opening sequence, he has some traits that like lend themselves to Spider-Man things. So like he's like jumping and like, putting his like little stickers, and it's like kind of acrobatic. And it's like, okay, all right, you have like, could be cool Spider-Man at some point. And then, yeah, how much time is spent on him and his art and design, and like how that's him expressing himself, I feel like then makes that moment where you reveal his suit and he's like spray painted the spider on it. Just like, it's such a great, like, oh, he's expressing himself now as Spider-Man. And just like that integration is another one of my favorite moments.
Yeah, it has to do with the creativity that you need Spider-Man to have, the innovation. So the scene where he ends up getting bitten, but it's that where he's doing the graffiti art in that like tunnel or wherever with his uncle. It's setting up so much of who we like will understand him to be. Like, why is Spider-Man quick on his feet? Why is he passionate and at the same time like sensitive and in touch with his feeling? Like all these things that Spider-Man has to be, to find images and like those few opening scenes that establish those traits right out of the gate. They make him lovable because we like characters that have those traits, but they also make him believable as a superhero, right? You have to have the stubbornness, a willingness to kind of shirk laws, all of these, being very innovative and quick. All of these things you have to have Spider-Man, and they do it before he ever gets bit.
Just want to have to talk about the animation a little with this
please
crazy thing. You have, first of all, I mean, it's just one of these movies like Scott Pilgrim where like even the production cards before the titles are cool.
Yes.
But then you get into the animation, and first of all, you have this weird, it's like CG, but it looks like it's stop motion, which is a really interesting choice. And Then you have use of the Ben-Day dots. Do you know what these are?
Mm-hmm.
These are what they would use in like old comics. They would just use dots of the 4 different colors that they had to, like, first of all, save time and cost, but then also to make new colors just by, if you look at the dots, you see them, and all that stuff. It takes more effort to do this thing that looks almost like it's meant to be a cost saving or time saving thing. And then also, we talked about this with Inside Out, but every time I see something that's animated, I always say, why is this animated? And with something like Spider-Verse, there is no question, obviously. Like, you are not making a live action movie version of this movie. But I really like the choice early on. You see Wilson Fisk is the size of a tool shed. So even before we get into crazy multiverse stuff, and also Green Goblin is like Hulk Green Goblin and stuff. So even before we're getting into Miles actually turning into Spider-Man and all this stuff, we are the animators are showing us, like, we are in animation land. We are not trying to be in serious world land. And the movie sort of, for how disorienting this movie could be, it orients you in the first couple minutes with the Peter Parker saying, let's do this again, stuff, but then also with the animation saying, this movie's going to be crazy, it's going to be stylized, it's going to be different, but here, just sort of go with us, and we're going to show you right up front what this movie's going to look like, and then we're going to mess with that as we go, but we're taking you right into crazy animation land right away. And then we're going to introduce, like, the comic panels as Miles starts becoming a comic book character. He starts thinking in comic book land and everything. So
Right.
I love the way that it hits you in the face with a lot of the animation choices, but then still saves so much for as the movie goes to broaden it and do all these different surprises along the way. There's so much color too.
I really appreciate animated films that, like you said, Brian, they're embracing the fact that they are working in this medium, and like they couldn't be any other way. Like it's not trying to replicate live action with like a exact replica of reality, but it's like embracing all the tools that exist in the animation art form. And that really stands out for me in the finale. Just the whole finale, where there's like the singularity, black hole craziness, the color palette changes,
the cross-dimensional battle.
Yeah, just so there's like wildly different like color backdrops at different moments. There's neon subway trains flying through. Like it's just there's just so much beauty in that finale that would be completely like nonsensical and way too chaotic and like an eyesore if it was trying to be rendered like realistically or like in a live action movie, but becomes just like elevates it into this like comic pop art amazingness. And so yeah, I really respect any film that it made a formal choice to tell this story in this form, and by God, we're going to use this form like all the way.
For as crazy as this movie is from the beginning, it really does a good job of saving things and slowly letting them unfurl. So
yes.
Just look at story. You start with Peter Parker, and then you introduce the multiverse, Peter B. Parker. Then you introduce Gwen, which is not too crazy once you've already introduced the multiverse. Then you, at the midpoint, so you wait until halfway into the movie, you introduce, now we're going into crazy cartoon multiverse land. And I think it's really smart that those characters we don't get too much time with them because they are so insane. They're sort of these nice supporting characters for about 30 minutes, and then they're gone before the big finale of the movie too.
Right.
And I love those characters, but I think there's a version of this movie where they come in 20 minutes in and you have the whole movie where you're following 6 different crazy people. And, I really like that, but it earns that crazy cross-dimensional battle at the end by not being that for 2 hours. It slowly peppers in these new story ideas and these new animation techniques and all this stuff, so that when you get to that finale, it feels so earned and it doesn't feel like it's coming out of nowhere.
Yeah. Whenever I watch it, all I can think about is like, it didn't have to look this good, because it's a great story, and it's like we've been talking about, really wisely approached and well written and genuinely funny with great lovable characters right at its core. You could have just animated it in like a pretty basic, even like cool way, and it still would be a good movie. So like when I think about some of the more traditionally animated movies that are really good movies, I don't know, for some reason the one I'm thinking of is Mulan, which I really like the original animated Mulan. It's great, it's fantastic, and it's a good story regardless of everything else and how it looks. There's some cool animation in it and everything like that, but there's some really interesting directorial choices also. I'm not knocking Mulan. All I'm saying is this movie absolutely did not need to push the envelope as hard as it did. They really, really wanted to do something crazy. And even Lord Miller's other movies, which I like the Lego movie a lot, and it definitely was boundary pushing and everything. And, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs is also fine. But this movie just goes so far beyond what it needed to do to be a good movie. And I have no idea how you get the energy to pour 200% of care and effort and money and time. Like, we didn't get a 75% version of this movie. We got a 120% version of this movie from top to bottom. And that's so remarkable in this day and age where it feels like, especially if you have an established franchise like Spider-Man or established property, that studios are just like, well, make a good one. That's kind of our like baseline thing that we're expecting from a superhero movie now. Like, is it going to be good? No one is expecting it to be amazing. And this movie is.
Amazing Spider-Man. This time I was trying to pay attention to what was happening, like what is the style, what are the elements of style, and then kind of did like a deep dive into it that ultimately arrived at another thematic integration that I think you'll appreciate, Trisha. But so the elements that were interesting to me is that there's no motion blur. So like at any moment you could pause it and it looks like an animated frame, which is cool. There's no camera focus technically. Like they use that idea kind of like you were talking about earlier, Brian, of like Ben-Day dots or these like printing limitations that happened when printed comic books where the colors would be out of alignment. So it's almost kind of like a chromatic aberration. So like there's still like instead of depth of field, there's like how in sync are the colors, and that's how they draw your attention to different places. And they used, there's all this like line work, right? Where so the characters furrow their brows and there's like, what you would think is just like a drawing of, this line as a furrow brow or a smile and all these details. And the way that they created it was by using like deep learning artificial intelligence to like go to different frames and be like, this is what it should look like here. This is what it should look like here. And kind of run this like algorithm over and over again until it was trained to know how to automatically generate these things. So instead of doing the traditional 3D animation where you have to like kind of bunch up the mesh and light it so that it'll make that, instead it's this completely new way of recreating a two-dimensional style on a three-dimensional object, which is really fascinating. And then the frame rate is like wacky. So like they called it on twos and on ones. So the camera work and the backgrounds and everything is happening on ones, which means every frame it's changing just like a normal movie would. But the characters for the most part are on twos. So every other frame they're moving. So they look more stuttery-ish, but kind of gives that sense of, a comic book, that old school style of animation. And the thing that I thought was interesting is that they use that to tell the story in the sequence where Miles and Peter B. Parker are going into, where they run into Doc Ock and they're trying to steal the computer, and then they're swinging away at the end. And Miles is like, you never taught me how to do this. And he's like, don't worry, I'll be fine. Across that sequence, as they start off, Miles and Peter B. Parker are on different syncs. So like their frame rates are different and offset. And as that sequence progresses, they slowly literally become in sync with the frame rate. And so I just thought that was like a cool way of like, again, not just doing style to do style, but like, let's use these tools to enhance what's happening in the story, which is pretty cool.
Right.
Yeah.
With just all of the love and heart poured into it. And I think that also comes through when you watch it. You don't have to be able to know all of what you just said, Michael, to know that this is immaculately crafted and there's a ton of care in every bit of it.
Well, I think that's why movies like this make me just smile and just kind of make me feel happy, is because there's like a transmission of passion and love coming through it, because there's no way that this much care would be put into something that somebody didn't really love, you know? Like, you have to care more than is required of you to make this movie. And that, I think that that energy you're talking about, Trisha, can only come from people who are just very passionate and very in love with the thing they're trying to make. And that's just what we all want, I think, ultimately, from what we watch and the art we see, is just that the people who made it love what they were doing.
So I have kind of like a question for you guys that I'm curious about, which is
17.
Okay, great. We're done. So one of the things that I find interesting is how like different mediums borrow filmmaking language. And so some like a problem for me that I've always had is like anime, I know is like great. Everyone says there's all these awesome stories and there's this artistry in it. And for some reason, I cannot get into anime. Like I can't interface with that style of visual storytelling. It's like a blocker for me. And so I'm curious if you guys have run into that in different places where like different, you know, there's animation where I feel like, you know, the Disney style of 2D animation is using some of film language, but I feel like it's not trying to recreate what it looks like when you're looking at something through a camera. And then there's kind of the Pixar end of the spectrum where it could be photorealistic. They're using actual lenses in the computer cameras that they're creating. Like it's hyper using film language and the idea of a physical camera in this space. And yeah, I'm just curious if you guys have had any different, if those are barriers or useful things for you when watching films, as far as getting invested in the story.
Specifically when watching films?
Films, animation, all of it. Are there, yeah.
The thing that popped into my mind when you were talking about that, Michael, and this is something totally different maybe, or I don't know if it is. I really struggle with the modern style of TV animation that's like adult cartoons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's something so messed up to me about, so like, you know, sort of like everything from Simpsons almost to like South Park to, I'm just going to name lots of shows that I can't watch that people are going to get mad about, like to something like Bob's Burgers or Rick and Morty. Like anything that is ostensibly an adult cartoon is not something I can like or have figured out how to like at all. And I think that it's because of this dissonance with the medium and the content. So like watching graphic violence unfold in an adult cartoon, which you sometimes get in something like South Park, where horrifying things are happening on screen with the tone of comedy because it's animated, and so somehow we're supposed to think it's funny rather than horrifying. I just can't. There's this thing in my brain that can't reconcile those two things together. The medium to me is fundamentally not doing what it's supposed to do. Or maybe it's because I'm actually invested in the characters and invested in the story, and the medium of animation is then being used to mess with me, right? Where people are just getting their heads chopped off or whatever it is that is happening to them, or, you know, just being crude. Maybe it's that I'm too invested in the characters actually, and I'm expecting more of like a serious approach to story, and it's being used for this like very adult style of comedy. I don't know what it is, but I don't know. I've like watched so many of those shows and everyone keeps telling me how great they are, and I'm just like, I hate this. I hate every minute of it. I'm sorry.
I can relate when something feels too disorienting, like where the animation feels too not what I'm used to. You know, for me, if it's Simpsons or Pixar, it's fine because I'm like, okay, I can like within 30 seconds, I can wrap my head around what I'm seeing. But sometimes you get these films that are more experimental with how they do things. And I think that's when I have a hard time because I feel like I can't even focus on the story I'm being told because my brain has not yet accepted that what I'm seeing is supposed to be something. It's not said well, but I've had that experience. I tend to try to not worry too much about what the medium is, and I know people can't help that. I remember someone once saying like, "Oh, I love foreign films," and I was like, "What a generalist, like, stupid thing to
There are a
say."
lot of movies not
Right,
made in the United States.
right. I'm like, first of all, you only love the foreign films that have made it here, like that, are
Right.
actually on the shelf at your video store or whatever. This is a long time ago.
Right.
And, um, but then I also hear people say the opposite, where I say, "Oh, let's watch this tonight." Say, "Oh, I don't feel like reading tonight," or "I don't like subtitles." And I'm like, "Are you kidding
uh,
me? Like, it's not that like okay." And I try to give that same mentality to whether a movie is animated or in a foreign language or black and white or who knows, like whatever thing it is. I try, granted, we all have our sticking points, but I try to just let a thing be what it is and not worry too much about making these general statements of like, well, if a thing is this, then I have this problem with it. So I don't really have a movie, Michael, but the thing that came to mind with me was appropriately graphic novels and comics, where because I did not grow up reading comics, I have tried to get into certain things like Watchmen. I read before the new series came out. I just got Neil Gaiman's Sandman, the first omnibus, and I've really enjoyed what I've been reading, but it did take my brain a while to say, you're not looking at pictures, you're not reading a book, you're doing this other thing that other people have been doing for decades, but you're just not used to it yet. So that can be something where like it just takes me time to adjust, but I don't really have anything that I just like completely will not try, but there are things that are just harder to get into than others.
For me, I do share some of the blocker with anime. And I think part of it is I'm like highly sensitive to frame rates, and
Mm.
like I was almost laughing out loud, almost like didn't know what to do with myself. I think we walked out, didn't we? Of The Hobbit, the first Hobbit movie we saw in
We
high
did.
frame rates,
Right.
3D.
Walk out.
And
Yes.
I was watching like dwarves walk around in like this weird, like goofy looking high frame rate. I just like I couldn't. I was like, I can't watch a 3 hour movie this way. I can't do it. And there's the same kind of thing with anime, like pure anime, where there is that slower frame rate going on, where motion is kind of has that like almost trippy like choppiness to it, and it's hard for me to get past that and just like take the movie in a neutral way. It's like a constant bump, but I know I'm missing out on like some of the best stuff ever. I've been hearing so much about Avatar is now on The Last Airbender is now on Netflix, and I want to watch that. And so yeah, I do want to get over that to have access to those stories, but it has been a reason to put off watching a lot of anime that I'm supposed to have seen already. The one other thing I will say for like live action that really sometimes I just can't get past is like a commitment to like almost like over the top or like in your face like verite handheld in a in a fictional film, where it's like this movie
Michael,
has like
can you quick check and make sure Paul Greengrass isn't one of our patrons?
Yeah, it's that thing where it's like this movie has a big budget. This isn't like if I'm seeing like the movie at Sundance that was made for like $7,000 and like all they have is like their iPhone or whatever, then that's like, okay, this is like a special like case of I'm gonna see what this person did with very little money. But if it's like a huge movie with huge actors, but like there's this commitment to like aggressive documentary style, like shaky, zoomy, like disorienting camera work that doesn't even seem to like I don't think serve the story most of the time, besides just being like, look how real and verite this feels. I cannot get past that sometimes. And it was actually I should see it again, but it really took me out of First Man. Like the commitment, because I think Damien Chazelle even said he wanted to feel like a 16 millimeter documentary at the time. So when he's like filming sequences, like letting it be like kind of out of focus or like
the opening sequence is very rattly,
right?
Which I really loved, but it is
right.
very, very rattly.
And it's like I can get down with it for like certain like key sequences where it's like, okay, we're doing something right now. But then when it's like he's arguing with his wife and it's also feels like a disorienting like documentary where I can't tell what's happening, that's where I'm just like, all right, like we are in a narrative fictional space now. Like we can be a little less crazy here. That's that's my other blocker, I think, with
Right.
certain movies. Yeah.
Real quick, I know we have some patrons who are anime fans because they've mentioned it a couple times on
Right.
our Q&As and stuff. And I think one of my blockers sometimes is not about the medium. It's just about how much is there that I would have to get into, because I tend to be a completionist with things where it's like, if I'm going to start this thing, I'm going to finish this thing. So like, for instance, that's why I have read some graphic novels, but haven't really read much in the way of comics. Cause I'm like, there've been 30 issues a year for 20 years. I'm probably not going to finish it. Also, I don't want to get into that. But that being said, patrons, tell us if there are some great animes we can check out that are not this huge commitment to 10,000 hours of content, something that we could watch, one season of a show or one movie or something like that. And I'd be more than happy to check it out.
And I might watch, no, I probably won't. I was like, I might watch one more adult cartoon. I've tried them all. Like,
You tried BoJack?
I was going to say.
Try BoJack.
I'm the same way, Trisha. BoJack is the only one that has worked for me.
Okay.
And to not leave you hanging, I bring this up because
why are we having complaining corner about this? We love Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.
Right. This became like a very negative podcast.
Right. I didn't mean for it to go through this whole thing, but this is a barrier for me with Into the Spider-Verse, where I think I'm not able to engage with it emotionally because I'm never sucked into the world. And so I can intellectually appreciate everything that we've been saying. It just, for some reason, doesn't work for me. Like I've realized I think I'm just not like graphically minded. Like sometimes people like see shots from a movie and it's like a weird angle and they're like, oh, that's weird. Why is that person's like chin so big? And I'm like, no, the camera's just very close to them and they're using a wide angle lens. So I think my brain my brain concerns itself with what was actually in front of the camera and not what it looks like when represented like on a 2D space. And so I think that's just something that I'm kind of identifying as like a weird thing. And then I think the frame rate thing, even though I think it's really clever how they use it, that was another blocker for me because the jittery frame rate does disorient me. And
it worked for me in this
stresses me
context
out.
because it was part of like a mash of things. It wasn't like a blanket kind of slow frame rate for all parts of the movie.
Well, this goes back to just how we all experience film as individuals. So, for example, and this I think is my problem with adult animated comedies. Like, for example, I am obsessed with story and characters and theme. Like, I think it's I didn't need to tell you that. But like, I think it's interesting listening to you talk about the frame rate. And I think it's really cool that they did everything that they did. And I do have an appreciation for the technical side of the way that movies are like created and put together. But I, like, for example, my partner won't watch a movie if it's like a bad copy of it or like a lower quality whatever version. Which
Right.
Absolutely not.
He's a reasonable person, is what.
Wow, all of you. See, to me, if the story and the characters are still compelling, I literally probably don't even notice. I
Wow.
probably wouldn't even notice. That's how the gut level on which film speaks to me. So, watching an amazing version of Apocalypse Now, which I just did, I was like, wow, this looks incredible. But I necessarily wouldn't be able to tell you why without looking it up or talking to you guys on this podcast. Why the characters speak to me and why the themes are resonant and all of that, the psychology of it, that's something that, I can pull apart all day. And that's why when somebody in South Park gets, killed, just exploded for no reason, I'm like, oh my gosh, that person just died. And I'm like, of course they did it, but that's what it feels like to me. And so
Like my mom watching me play Grand Theft Auto. Every time the car like hits a telephone pole like slightly, she's like, oh.
And so Into the Spider-Verse, when I think about this movie, the things that I think about are the relationship between Peter B. Parker and Miles Morales. I think about the really touching and powerful expressions of the theme, as we've talked about. I think about some of the tone and the way that it supports some of the other like thematic messages that are in here. But ultimately, I think about the story structure and like where it concludes and what it means that this movie exists in the world. which to me is like the most incredibly beautiful thing about it. The fact that this movie got made and exists now, and so young people get to watch it. So all of that, like, I'm never gonna bump on the frame rate ever. Not if you're doing all of that so powerfully and beautifully at the same time.
Well, it really, hearing you talk, you're coming at film as a writer to the core. It's like it's writer brain all the way. Whereas like for Michael and I know for myself for sure, it was always about directing for me. Like when I was first inspired by Jurassic Park and all these movies, it was like, I want to make these visuals, and then I realized that it's only good because of the script later, but it's like, but it was about the image and the sound and the, that stuff. And so it's interesting how, whatever first drew us into the medium seems to be the way that we're stuck on but I like it because of this,
Yeah. Well, and I think I spent a lot of time in high school learning 3D animation. And so much of that is training your brain to see things in 3 dimension and see how a camera then translates that to 2 dimensions. And so I think that might be where some of that comes from. But I think, I think it's interesting that we all can watch a movie and love a movie, and yet clearly we're all coming at it from these different places. And so I think that's just kind of what I wanted to explain. I didn't mean to go into a downer mode, but I just think it's interesting that I
don't think it was downer.
It was interesting.
Yeah.
That I think everyone brings different things to the experience. And I think it's just one of the cool things about
There's a difference between, what are some movies you think are bad, and what is something that you personally find that you can't get past. I think that's an interesting thing. Real quick, I think both times I watched Spider-Verse, I did have a 3 to 5 minutes of my brain going, this isn't what I'm used to looking at. This isn't what Pixar and DreamWorks and Disney animated movies have taught me to expect from CG 3D kind of animation. And for me personally, after those first few minutes, I was totally in it and no problem. I think that a lot of times, same thing, Trisha, if I'm watching a screener of a movie that's a low quality kind of thing, where I'm like, oh, this is bad quality, and then 5 minutes in, whatever, I'm just watching the story now. So I think that for me, I was able to do that, but I also maybe had the same thing that you had, Michael, but it only lasted me a couple minutes and then I was able to get over it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that just comes from this film does something new. They created something new. Yeah. And so that's just going to come with the territory when you're forging new territory.
Which is what a thrill.
Forge territory. There's some metaphor. Exploring. Why don't we go around and
breaking new ground?
Yes, breaking new ground. What lessons are we going to forge from Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse? Alex, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I think one thing I was thinking about while the credits were rolling, and I saw I forgot there's 3 directors, and we've been talking about the collaborative process that goes into a film like this, and it ties back to, it's also a collaborative story. It's a bunch of different Spider people coming together. It's not just one singular hero, even though we have a main character in Miles Morales. It's about the group and about the friendship and the bond that brings them together, and they all help each other. And I'm noticing that there might be an interesting shift happening right now, which I like, away from these pop culture stories that are more like the Superman story, or just the Spider-Man by himself story, into these. It's almost like taking the Joseph Campbell monomyth, and I don't know if it's a polymyth, but doing these big archetypal stories, but with the collaboration of different types of characters. And I think that's a really neat trend. And I think it feels more resonant to the modern moment we're in, of just the hero we need is not a singular person, but a bunch of different archetypes working together. That's the hero we need. And I like that that's showing up in these massive pop culture.
You must love the Marvel movies then.
Yeah, I was gonna say you must be a huge Avengers fan.
I'm not saying I like all those movies, but I like that is showing up. I really like Endgame.
Awesome. Brian?
It's funny because I feel like my lesson is 18 years in the works, because it's something that whenever I talk about it, I always use Spider-Man 1 as an example, which is, I remember seeing the first Spider-Man, the first Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, and I did not like it. I did not like any of those movies. I mean, I recognize that 2 is a pretty good movie, but my biggest problem with especially the first one, and definitely comes back in the third one, is I just felt like I don't know if this is trying to be a movie or it's trying to be a comic book. And I think that was something that happened a lot in those mid 2000s movies, like the Ben Affleck Daredevil and Catwoman and that kind of thing, is they were trying to, they were like, we're trying to be a movie that's also a comic book, and we're not really sure where we are in between. Around that same time, you have X-Men 1 and 2 and Batman Begins, which to me felt like movies. They felt like they were like, we know this medium and we are working within this medium. Yes, we are telling these elevated stories that are maybe sometimes going to get a little comic booky, but for the most part, we are very grounded in movie world. Then I saw Sin City, which I very much did not like, but I really, really respected that Robert Rodriguez said, I literally want to just put the book on screen. So he was like, I don't even want to make a movie. I just want to make a
Right.
comic book that moves with, Elijah Wood and some, crazy glasses, whatever. Like, and I thought, okay, maybe I didn't like the movie, but I at least respected that you went all the way with what your idea was. You weren't living in sort of half measure territory, which brings us to Spider-Verse, a Spider-Man movie that goes all the way with what it is. And I think it does it in a amazing way, where to me, something like Sin City doesn't. I mean, it's fine for what it is. It's just not my thing personally. But I think that if you look at something like Scott Pilgrim or John Wick or Fury Road, it's like these movies that are saying, we are just going balls to the wall with this idea. We are not going to try to pretend that we're trying to be like every other movie. We're just going to go crazy and do this thing. And that can fail horribly, but I really respect the idea of just no half measures, just completely going all the way with whatever your idea is and fully embracing it. And I think no matter what, you're going to end up with something more interesting. How many times have you seen a movie where you go, it was okay, and like, I would almost rather say like, I really hated that or I really loved it than it was okay. Like, I just want to have like a strong response to something.
There's a good quote from West Wing where Leo tells the staff, like, if you're going to be walking into walls, I want us running into them. So that's
such a West Wing line.
Yeah. Awesome. Trisha?
I have a couple of things that I want to say here really quickly. Alex, I was thinking about what you just said about this more community-focused idea of a protagonist and a hero. And I think that that's part of the reason why this feels modern.
Yeah.
I think that has to do with creators that are actually plugged into what's happening sociopolitically right now.
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of like culturally pluralistic worldview that is rising to public consciousness, but especially in entertainment. And it's, I think, also why the Avengers and that kind of like, we still have our special people, but we have to have all of them. And there's this really strong sense of like community or communal storytelling that we see across media right now, and that's what it is to be a modern movie. I think in a lot of ways. So just anyway, that's neither here nor there, but that's what is making me think about. The thing that I also really appreciate about this movie is the settings, if I can put it that way. Like, I've been thinking a lot about settings, but especially settings of action sequences. And when I think about the action sequences in this movie, one of the ones that jumps to mind is the one at Aunt May's house, where it's like in the living room.
Yeah.
It's just like in the living room.
Yeah.
And but there's, all of the spider people and like all of the henchmen are in there. You've got like Scorpion and whoever those guys are.
Frankenstein dude.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I keep expecting Brian to tell me their names.
Tombstone.
Thank you. Tombstone is the one I was trying to think of. But I just think of, it's a really interesting, unconventional approach to where an action scene takes place. Like, you don't expect to see superheroes in a suburban living room fighting it out. And the same thing with that scene, which is one of the most famous ones in Spider-Verse now, which is at the graveyard. And They end up like, hitching a ride on the train that goes by, the subway that goes by. But it's snowy, it's nighttime, they're in a church like cemetery. It's a really interesting place for an action sequence. And both of those, but as well as even things like the scene where they're in the abandoned tunnel and they're doing the graffiti art, and the final one at the Collider, the final action sequence at the Collider. All of those spaces are not ones that I've ever really seen on film before, as precisely as they're rendered, but also that we rarely see action sequences in. And so I think there's just something to be said for, if you have a plot element, maybe we should dive into this in a video at some point, but maybe if you have a plot element and the action has to be a certain thing, like Miles meets Peter B. Parker and they almost get caught by the police, that could literally take place almost anywhere. And the fact that it takes place in this like quiet cemetery, starts in this quiet like church cemetery, and then moves onto the streets of New York in a really interesting and exciting way, is really cool. And I like I said, I love that scene in the living room and kitchen too, where they're just like on the stairs and they're like smashing the sofa. And the scene too with Prowler where he's in his uncle's apartment? Yeah, he's in his own uncle's apartment.
The stealth scene.
Exactly. Yes. Where it's a familiar location to the hero, so it should be a safe place, but then, Prowler shows up. It's just really thoughtfully constructed action sequences set in interesting locations.
I love that when Prowler opens the window, you hear that sound, that like sound design sound that it follows him, and it's sort of made to be like it's the sound of the window opening, and it's just really cool.
Yeah, I feel like the lesson I was kind of thinking about, we've already talked a lot about, is collaboration. So I don't know that I need to like dive into it, other than I was thinking about what does collaboration force one to do versus trying to have a singular vision when creating something like this. And I feel like there still needs to be a unifying goal or thing that is everything is working toward. And so I think when it's not a singular person's vision, perhaps it's easier to have the theme be that thing. And so it might be an easier way to like, maybe not easier, there's a lot of egos that have to get out of the way. But if you can't just be like, well, whatever he says is what we're going to do, then you have to kind of all agree on this is the thing that we're trying to do. And then that puts it out in the open and lets you measure it and comment on it and figure out how you want to do it in a more direct way, which can be tricky to arrive at if you're just in your head doing something in isolation. So I think that's one of the cool things that I think can come from collaboration. And I think it's very clear that that's exactly what happened in Spider-Verse, because as we've said, everything top to bottom is working in tandem to create this film.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, patrons, for supporting the channel and for voting for this movie. This has been really fun. We're excited to see what you guys choose for next month. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thwip and release.